The age of medieval knights did not begin with songs, tournaments, and shining vows. It began with a hard truth that every ruler learned sooner or later: if you cannot organize violence, you will be swallowed by someone who can. And in the centuries where kingdoms were still forming, where borders were more like suggestions than lines, and where authority often depended on who could arrive first with armed men, the knight appeared as a solution to a problem, not a decorative symbol of honor. A knight was discipline strapped onto a horse, a mobile shock unit backed by land, loyalty, training, and a social structure that turned raw fighting into an organized tool. To understand this era, you have to zoom out and look at war as something bigger than a single battlefield. Medieval war was a long chain of decisions that started months before swords ever met. You had to raise men, secure food, maintain horses, choose routes, protect supply, negotiate alliances, intimidate rivals, and decide what you actually wanted: a castle, a hostage, a marriage pact, a tax payment, a claim to land. And only after those goals were clear did armies move, because medieval conflict was often less about annihilating an enemy and more about forcing them to accept a new reality, and knights were one of the main instruments for forcing that reality, because they were fast, armored, trained, and psychologically intimidating. A knight was expensive, brutally expensive, and that fact shaped everything. If you imagine a medieval knight like a soldier, you miss the point. He was closer to a walking investment. A warhorse alone could cost a fortune, armor was custom work, weapons had to be maintained, training took years, and none of this was possible without a supporting base of wealth. This is why the knight is tied to the feudal world. Land produced food, taxes, and labor, and those resources produced horses, armor, and time to train. So the knight is not just a fighter, he is a product of an economy designed to keep a minority of men permanently prepared for violence. From childhood, the pathway was built to create obedience before independence. A boy was shaped into someone who could function inside hierarchy, because medieval war was noisy, confusing, and unpredictable, and the only thing that kept units from collapsing into panic was discipline that had been drilled long before the first arrow flew. A future knight learned how to ride not only for speed but for control, how to hold posture for long periods, how to handle a weapon while moving, how to coordinate with others, how to follow signals, how to wait. Waiting is a skill in war, and medieval commanders valued men who could hold position without breaking, because a line that holds becomes a wall, and a wall can decide a battle. Knighthood also carried a social code, and that code was not only about politeness, it was about predictability. Predictability makes groups function. When you expect a man to keep his oath, to obey his lord, to defend his banner, to protect his companions, you can plan around him. A medieval army was not a professional force in the modern sense, it was a coalition of relationships, personal bonds, obligations, and mutual advantage, and knights were the key links in that chain. They were the men a lord counted on when things became dangerous, because they were trained to act under pressure. Now here is where the order truly comes in. The popular image of medieval combat is a chaotic swarm of individual duels, everyone swinging wildly, but real medieval warfare, especially at the higher level where nobles and knights operated, depended on formations and timing, not modern drill like gunpowder armies, but still a clear structure. Armies were arranged in divisions, groups under specific leaders, with banners serving as moving reference points, because on a battlefield you cannot call everyone by name. You cannot run to every group to explain a new plan. You need symbols that hold people together, and banners did that. They were like anchors in the storm. Men fought near their banner because it told them where they belonged, and when a banner moved, the unit moved. When a banner fell, morale cracked, because it felt like the unit itself had died. Knights, in particular, were used as shock, but shock does not mean random. A cavalry charge that works is not a bunch of riders sprinting independently, it is controlled momentum. Spacing matters, direction matters, speed matters, and nerves matter. The goal is to hit the enemy at the moment they are least stable, when their line is already tired, when their feet are stuck in mud, when they are turning, when they are distracted by missiles, when their leaders are separated, and the knights. Charge becomes a moving wall of weight and steel, not because knights are magical, but because physics and psychology combine. A disciplined mass of armored riders can create a fear wave that breaks less disciplined troops, and once a line breaks, the battle often becomes a chase, and a chase is where casualties explode, which is why medieval commanders cared so much about keeping order, because the most dangerous moment is not the first clash. It is the moment one side loses cohesion. But knights were not only used for the open field charge, and this is where medieval warfare becomes more realistic and less cinematic, because most medieval wars were not decided by heroic charges in open grass, they were decided by pressure, and pressure usually meant castles, roads, bridges, towns, and supply. Castles were not just homes, they were military machines. Stone and height turned a small group into a defensive problem that could stall an army for weeks or months, and knights were often the leaders and specialists in these operations, not always the men pushing ladders, but the men organizing the siege lines, leading patrols, defending supply routes, negotiating surrenders, and controlling the rhythm of the campaign. Because a campaign is a living thing, it gets hungry, it gets tired, it loses discipline if you do not feed it, and feeding an army was one of the hardest tasks in the medieval world. So when a lord gathered knights, he was not only gathering fighters, he was gathering managers of violence, people who could enforce discipline among less trained troops, people whose presence made others behave. Because a knight represented authority with a sword behind it. If a peasant levy started to panic, a knight's shout and example could stabilize them, not because peasants were cowards by nature, but because they were not trained for war as a constant identity. They had farms, families, seasons, and their lives were not built around battle readiness. A knight's life was built around readiness. And that difference is the heart of medieval military order. There is also a crucial point that makes knights feel dominant in their era. They were an elite in a time where elites mattered more, not only in skill but in protection. Armor is a technology, not just clothing, and it changes the logic of combat. When armor improves, the weapons and tactics change. When helmets, mail, and later plate coverage become better, a knight can survive blows that would drop an unarmored man instantly, which means he can stay in the fight longer, keep his nerve longer, and continue to apply pressure. And in war, pressure is often more important than style. A protected soldier is not just safer, he is mentally freer to execute plans without flinching. And that mental advantage is enormous, because fear makes people shrink, and shrinking breaks formations. Yet, knights were never unstoppable, and the era of knights is also the era where their limits slowly become visible. Disciplined infantry with long weapons, coordinated missile troops, terrain choices, defensive positioning, and stubborn cohesion could neutralize cavalry shock. and this is why medieval commanders obsess over the ground. The ground is like a hidden weapon. Mud can reduce speed. Slopes can ruin formation. Narrow lanes can force knights into bottlenecks. Forests can hide ambushes. Rivers can trap retreat, and in medieval war, retreat itself is a complex action. Retreat is not running. Retreat is reorganized movement under pressure, and knights were expected to cover retreats, to hold rear guards, to perform the hardest tasks because their armor and training gave them the best chance to survive those moments. The knightly world also produced a particular style of leadership, because knights were often minor lords or noble retainers. They were socially close to the decision-makers, which means they were not just obeying, they were also advising, negotiating, competing for status, and trying to gain rewards, and this competition created both strength and weakness. Strength because ambition can push men to act boldly. Weakness because ambition can make units charge too early, fight for glory rather than plan, and that tension, between discipline and pride, runs through the entire knight era like a crack in a stone wall. Sometimes it holds, sometimes it splits. And then there is the psychological side. Medieval war was personal, not personal as in friendly, personal as in you often knew the names of the men across from you, you knew their lords, their colors, their reputations, and reputations were weapons. A knight with a feared reputation could shake morale before the first clash, because medieval armies were not anonymous masses, they were networks of identity. And identity makes people either stand or break, so knights trained not only their bodies, but their presence, their posture, their confidence, because confidence spreads, and panic spreads faster. When you put all of this together, you start to see the knight era clearly, not as a fantasy, but as an age where war was becoming organized through social structure, where violence was professionalized inside a feudal economy, where military order depended on hierarchy, banners, cohesion, logistics, and timing, and where the knight served as the sharp, expensive edge of that system, the edge that could break a line, hold a bridge, lead a raid, guard a retreat, or force a surrender. And in the next part we will step directly into the battlefield plan itself, how an army was arranged on the day of combat, what stood in front, what stayed behind, how commanders used reserves, how charges were prepared, and how a battle could swing from control to collapse in minutes when order cracked. Picture the morning of a medieval battle not as a sudden clash but as a long, tense construction of violence, hours where men are not swinging swords yet, they are arranging themselves like pieces on a board, because the real secret of medieval combat is that the killing starts after the order is built, and if the order is built wrong, you lose before the first impact. So commanders obsess over positioning, spacing, banners, reserves, terrain, and the single hardest thing in a pre-radio world: control. Medieval armies did not look like modern armies, but they still had structure, usually divided into three main groupings: the vanguard, the center, and the rear guard, sometimes called battles, or divisions, each under its own lord or captain, and each with its own banner, because the banner is not decoration, it is your moving address in a storm of dust and noise. Your banner tells you where your leaders are, where your friends are, where your duty is, and if you lose sight of it you are one step closer to panic. And panic is the true enemy, not steel. So the battlefield begins with a plan that is simple enough to survive chaos, because medieval commanders cannot micromanage once things start, they can only set the initial shape and hope discipline holds long enough to take advantage of weaknesses. The plan might be something like this. The vanguard engages first to fix the enemy in place. The center holds steady and protects the main banner. The rear guard stays slightly back as a reserve, not because they are cowardly but because a reserve is the difference between control and collapse. A reserve is the hand you keep hidden until the moment the opponent makes a mistake, and medieval battles are full of mistakes because fear makes men rush. Now, where do the knights fit inside this? Knights, especially mounted knights, are not the whole army. They are the shock tool, the heavy hammer, and you do not swing a hammer randomly, you swing it at the moment a wall is already trembling, which means knights need supporting troops, they need infantry to anchor lines, they need missile troops to disturb and thin the enemy, they need scouts to read terrain, and they need commanders who understand timing. Because a charge launched too early is like throwing your best weapon into a swamp. A medieval battlefield is therefore layered. The front might contain infantry lines, men with spears, axes, bills, or swords, some of them trained, some of them levies. Behind or beside them you might see missile troops, archers, crossbowmen, slingers in some regions. Their job is not always to kill as much as to create disorder, because disorder opens gaps, and gaps are what cavalry lives for. And behind them you often find the mounted elite, the knights and men-at-arms, gathering in clusters around banners, waiting for the moment they are released. Waiting is a weapon. And the waiting is not passive. While they wait, messengers ride, small groups reposition, commanders watch the enemy's line like hunters watching a herd, looking for the slightest sign, a flank that is too far forward, an infantry block that is drifting, an overconfident group of knights eager for glory. Because medieval armies are not machines, they are collections of proud men, and pride makes them predictable. When a commander chooses to charge, it is rarely a single clean wave like in movies, it is more like a chain reaction, first a small push, then a larger release, then a surge as everyone feels the moment has arrived, and the best commanders try to keep that surge controlled. They try to keep distance between groups so that if the first wave fails, the second wave does not crash into the first wave's confusion, because that is how cavalry dies. Not by being outfought, but by being trapped in its own mess. Horses cannot pivot easily in tight crowds, armored men cannot quickly stand up if they fall, and a stalled charge becomes a pile of expensive targets. So how does a proper medieval charge happen? It begins with alignment. Riders are not just galloping, they are forming a rough front, enough spacing so horses do not collide, enough closeness so momentum becomes collective, lances lowered not at random but with a purpose, some aim for shields, some aim for horses, some aim for the gaps between men, and the real objective is not just impact, it is breakage, the breaking of the enemy's cohesion, because once a line breaks, the battle becomes a chase, and a chase is where armored cavalry can turn advantage into domination. But the line will not break if it is prepared. That is why infantry formations matter. Disciplined infantry does not stand as scattered individuals, it stands as a body, with spears or pikes angled outward, with men braced shoulder to shoulder, with a shared understanding that if they hold for a few seconds, the cavalry's advantage evaporates, because horses do not like solid walls of sharp points, and even brave horses hesitate when they smell danger. So knights need the enemy to be tired, distracted, shaken, or disorganized before they slam into them. This is where missiles and skirmishers become more than side characters. Archers and crossbowmen are used to irritate, to force shields up, to create small wounds that drain morale, to trigger angry countercharges, to pull enemy knights out of position, and commanders love it when the enemy makes the first mistake, because the first mistake usually comes from emotion, and emotion is expensive in war. Medieval commanders therefore try to shape the enemy's emotions. They use terrain to tempt arrogance, they place their strongest units where the enemy thinks they are weakest, they hide reserves behind a hill or in a shallow fold of land, they place stakes or obstacles to slow cavalry lanes, they anchor flanks on rivers, woods, or marshy ground, because the smartest way to win is to reduce the enemy's options until their only choice is the one you prepared for. And this is why terrain is so central to the knight era. Open fields favor cavalry, but open fields are rare in the perfect sense. Fields have ditches, hedges, soft earth, slopes, and these details decide everything. A slight incline can rob a charge of speed, a muddy patch can turn a proud line into a stumbling jam, a narrow lane can force knights to arrive in a thin stream instead of a wall, and a thin stream can be cut to pieces by infantry who are not forced to bend or panic. This is also why medieval battles often start with a strange stillness, both sides testing each other, moving slightly, looking for the best ground, because once the first big movement begins, it becomes harder to stop. Commanders fear being locked into a bad position, because in medieval battle, repositioning under pressure is extremely difficult, especially for large bodies of men without synchronized drill. So how did they communicate? They used banners, horns, drums, shouted commands, messengers on horseback, and pre-arranged plans, and the key point is this: medieval commanders could not constantly update everyone, they had to rely on units acting based on earlier instruction: hold here until we signal, charge when the vanguard engages, protect the banner, do not pursue too far, and those are short orders that can survive noise. Because if the order requires a paragraph, it will die on the battlefield. This is where the knight's discipline becomes visible. A knight is trained to recognize signals and maintain cohesion, to resist the urge to chase personal glory when the commander needs control. But this is also where medieval battles become unpredictable, because not all knights resist that urge. Some see an opening and chase, some see a rival and break formation to reach him, some become obsessed with capturing a noble for ransom, because ransoms are massive money, and suddenly your battle plan is being eaten by human desire. This is why commanders keep reserves, not only for tactical flexibility but to patch the holes created by human behavior. A reserve can stabilize a collapsing flank, replace a tired line, countercharge enemy cavalry that has overextended, or exploit a gap that appears for a few minutes before closing again, and those few minutes are what medieval commanders live for, because medieval battles are often decided in short windows: order holds, order strains, order cracks, and once it cracks, events accelerate, the crack turns into a tear. The tear turns into a rout, and then the rout turns into slaughter, not because commanders want it, but because men running are vulnerable and the chasing side becomes a storm. But there is another reality that makes the knight era even more strategic: most wars are not decided by one battle at all. They are decided by raids, sieges, and attrition. A medieval campaign might spend far more time burning crops, capturing small towns, taking bridges, cutting supply routes, and threatening castles than fighting open battles, because open battles are risky, and medieval rulers are often risk-averse when their entire claim to power is on the line. If you lose your army, you might lose your throne, so the smarter move is often to pressure the enemy until they surrender a castle or agree to terms. And knights are perfect for this style of warfare. Because they can move quickly, conduct raids, strike weak points, escort wagons, protect foragers, and punish rebels, they are mobile authority. Raids in the Knight era are not random violence either, they are planned operations. You choose a target that hurts the enemy economically and psychologically, a mill, a granary, a market town, you strike quickly, you take prisoners, you burn what you cannot carry, you retreat before the enemy's main force arrives, and you repeat. This is how you force decisions without risking everything in a single day. And this constant pressure can be more effective than a heroic battle, because it drains morale, drains resources, and makes peasants hate the lord who cannot protect them. And then come the sieges, the slow wars. A siege is a test of endurance and engineering, building lines around a fortress, cutting off water or supply, digging, building towers, using trebuchets, negotiating, bribing, threatening, because medieval commanders know that the easiest way to take a castle is often to convince someone inside to open a gate. So war is both steel and persuasion. Knights serve as leaders here, as the men who can enforce discipline in siege camps, prevent desertion, organize patrols, lead assaults when required, and often negotiate surrender terms. Because surrender is a normal outcome in medieval war, it is a transaction, not always a final humiliation. The Knight era therefore creates a specific military mindset. War is not, fight until death. War is, apply pressure until the enemy's structure fails, and structure can fail through fear, hunger, money, politics, or the sudden collapse of a line on a battlefield. And the knights sit in the middle of all these pressures, as fighters, leaders, symbols, and investments. Now, zoom back to the battlefield again, because there is one moment that defines everything, the moment of line break. A line breaks when men stop believing the person next to them will hold. It can start with something tiny, an arrow wound, a commander falling, a banner tilting, a rumor that the flank is gone, a cavalry group pushing too close, a gap opening in the infantry because someone stepped back, and once one man steps back, the man next to him thinks, if he steps back, should too, and then you get a wave, and waves spread faster than courage, and at that moment the knights are unleashed like hounds. Because the best time to use cavalry is when the enemy is already losing their shape. But if the enemy does not break, if the infantry holds and the missiles keep biting, then knights can be neutralized, they can be forced into repeated charges that exhaust horses, they can be dragged into rough ground, they can be separated from their supports, and once separated, even elite warriors become vulnerable. Because medieval war punishes isolation. Isolation is death in any era. But especially here where rescue is slow and confusion is constant. So the truth of the Knight era is not that knights are unbeatable, it is that they are decisive when used correctly, and using them correctly means thinking in systems, banners, divisions, reserves, terrain, pressure, morale, and timing. In the next part, we're going to make this even sharper. We will walk through a full medieval battle like a commander would, from scouting and choosing ground, to arranging vanguard and reserves, to the first missile exchanges, to the moment cavalry is released, to the dangerous temptation of pursuit, and how a win can turn into a disaster if knights chase too far and get trapped. Before the battle is a battle, it is a hunt for ground, because medieval commanders know that the land is the first weapon and the first judge, so the day begins with scouts moving ahead like feelers on an insect, riding out to check where the enemy is gathering, where they sleep, how their banners are arranged, whether their cavalry is restless or cautious, whether their infantry is compact or scattered, and most importantly what the terrain is doing to them, because if the enemy is forced to stand with a marsh behind them, or a slope under their feet, or a narrow lane on their flank, then you have already placed your hands on their throat without swinging a sword, and the commander who understands this does not rush. He lets the enemy walk into discomfort. He watches where they naturally drift, where their formations want to settle, and he chooses a position that turns his own weaknesses into something protected by nature. Once the ground is chosen, the army becomes a living construction site. Men step into roles as if putting on armor for the mind. The vanguard takes shape first because it is the spear tip and the bait at the same time. The center forms around the main banner because the main banner is not just a symbol, it is the location of authority, the promise that someone is still in control. And the rear guard or reserve stays back not as an afterthought but as a locked chest of options, because medieval warfare is full of sudden surprises, and the reserve is how you answer a surprise without turning your entire army into a confused wave, and while this happens you can feel the tension build, not cinematic tension but practical tension, the kind that makes men double-check straps and tighten girths and adjust helmets and look sideways at the faces of their neighbors. Because in a medieval battle the greatest fear is not death in some abstract way, the greatest fear is that the people beside you will break, because if they break, your armor becomes a cage, your horse becomes a trap, and your skill becomes irrelevant, so everyone watches everyone else, and the commander watches the entire mass like a man trying to hold a wild animal by its chain. Then comes the silent part of battle that is not silent at all, the waiting where you test the enemy with movement but not commitment. The front lines inch, they stop, they inch again. Commanders send riders along the line to keep spacing consistent, because spacing is the first layer of discipline. Too tight and you choke your own movement, too loose and you invite gaps that turn into wounds. And in this stage the plan is simple enough to survive the noise later. Hold the center steady, do not throw cavalry away early, force the enemy to spend energy moving toward you, keep your flanks anchored on terrain, and let missiles do their job, because missiles in this era are not just about casualties, they are about irritation and imbalance. They make men lift shields, they make men flinch, they make horses uneasy, they tempt angry charges, they create the tiny disruptions that can grow into full breaks when the pressure hits. When the missile phase begins it feels like the battle is speaking for the first time. Archers step forward in loose order, crossbowmen move with slower rhythm, and you can tell immediately which side is disciplined, because disciplined missile troops do not fire like a crowd at a festival, they fire with purpose, they pick dense areas, they aim to force movement, they aim to make the enemy shuffle, and shuffling is dangerous because it changes the shape of formations, and formations are fragile shapes made of tired men, and while arrows and bolts move through the air, the commander is not staring at the sky, he is staring at the enemy's posture, because the posture tells you everything. If the enemy line edges forward unevenly, if one wing pushes out too fast, if their cavalry begins to cluster in a way that suggests impatience, then the commander sees the next step before it happens. He prepares the counter like a door trap, and he sends a quiet message down the line, not a dramatic speech, just a clear signal: hold, hold, do not move, let them come, because the commander is trying to make the enemy spend their discipline first. Now the most dangerous moment arrives, the moment knights crave and commanders fear, the moment cavalry wants to charge, because knights are trained for aggression and status, and standing still feels like weakness, so commanders have to control their own elite, and that control is not purely authority, it is psychology. A good commander keeps knights busy, he assigns them to protect flanks, to watch for enemy riders, to stay behind the infantry line until a specific signal, because if you release them early they might hit a prepared wall and stall, and a stalled cavalry mass is the worst situation imaginable. Horses crowd, armor locks men into place, and infantry can swarm around edges and pull them into a tangle, so the commander waits for a reason, and reasons come in predictable forms, a gap, a stumble, a drift, a unit that moved forward too far and lost contact with the units beside it. And once that happens the commander's mind becomes brutally simple: do not chase the whole line, strike the weak segment, widen the crack, and let the crack become a tear. So the charge is often not one clean thunder wave, it is a controlled release that tries to stay controlled even as adrenaline tries to destroy control. The first group moves out in a tight cluster around a banner so they do not dissolve into individual duels. The second group follows with enough distance that they can react to the first group's outcome, and the infantry remains steady because infantry is the spine. And without the spine cavalry becomes a flailing arm, and as the knights start to move the battlefield's tempo changes instantly, you can feel it, the enemy feels it too, because cavalry movement is a psychological event, it announces intention, it announces momentum, it forces decisions, and decisions under fear create mistakes, so the commander uses this to squeeze, he times it so the enemy is already distracted by missiles, already tired from holding formation, already uncertain about whether to advance or hold, and then the cavalry hits like a door slamming shut, not necessarily killing everyone, but forcing bodies to shift and squeeze and step back, and that step back is the seed of disaster. But the smartest enemy does not panic, the smartest enemy tries to absorb the shock without breaking, they tighten formation, they brace, they keep spears forward, they keep shields locked, they let the cavalry hit and rebound, and in those cases knights do not win by heroic swinging, they win by repeating pressure while the rest of the army supports, because cavalry that cannot break a line must not keep slamming blindly, it must pull back, reform, and look for a softer angle, and this is where medieval battles become chess games inside chaos. Commanders watch for overextension, because the moment a knight group pulls back to reform, there is a vulnerability, horses are turning, spacing widens, and if the enemy cavalry countercharges at that moment, your own knights can be caught sideways, so commanders use reserves to cover reforming cavalry, and they use infantry to prevent the enemy from running into the exposed lanes, and all of this is happening with signals and messengers. And instinct, because there is no map in your hand, there is only dust and noise and the sight of banners moving like ships at sea. Now we reach the moment that decides whether you have a victory or a disaster, the moment of pursuit, because medieval battles are full of a cruel trick, winning feels like the time to relax, but it is often the time you are most vulnerable, when an enemy line begins to break. The instinct of knights is to chase. Chase means prisoners, ransoms, loot, glory, and the emotional satisfaction of seeing the enemy run. But pursuit breaks your own order, it stretches you out, it separates groups, it pulls you away from your infantry support, and it can lure you into bad ground, so the commander's most important order might be the most hated order: stop the chase, regroup, protect the banner, because a disciplined army that stops pursuit can keep its shape and survive surprises, but an army that chases like a wave can smash into a hidden rock and split apart. This is where reserves become the silent killers of medieval warfare, because a clever commander on the losing side might have held a fresh unit back specifically for this moment, not to win the main clash, but to punish the pursuers, to slam into scattered knights who are busy chasing individuals, to cut off their path back, to turn their hunger into fear, and when that happens the victory flips in seconds. Because knights who are isolated are no longer a wall of momentum, they become small groups surrounded by uncertainty, and uncertainty ruins horses, ruins communication, ruins courage, and suddenly your army is fighting two battles, the main battle you thought you won, and the emergency battle to rescue your scattered elite, and if you fail to rescue them you might still win the field but lose your most valuable fighters, which is a long-term defeat even if the day's banners say you were successful. So a disciplined commander treats victory like a fragile object. He gathers his men back toward the banner. He sends cavalry not to chase but to screen, to keep enemy remnants from forming a new line. He uses infantry to secure ground. He checks flanks. He looks for the enemy reserve because the enemy reserve is the hidden knife. And he sends messengers to reassert the simple order: hold together, stay near your banner. Do not run alone, because the battle is not finished until the enemy is. Unable to reorganize, and the enemy is not unable until you have either captured their leadership, cut their retreat routes, or forced them into a surrender that collapses their willingness to continue the campaign. After the main clash, the battle often turns into a series of smaller controlled actions, securing wounded men, collecting prisoners, pulling back exhausted units, reforming in case the enemy tries a last push, and this is where medieval war reveals its true character. It is not just violence, it is management under stress, and knights are at the center of this management, because their social status gives them authority, their armor gives them survivability, and their training gives them the ability to remain functional when others are breaking, but even they are not immune to exhaustion, because armor is heavy, heat builds, horses tire, and the mind can only hold tension for so long, so the commander's job is to decide when to stop pressing and when to consolidate, because pressing too long can cause your own order to collapse, and in medieval war, an exhausted winner can be destroyed by a fresh enemy the next day, which is why campaigns matter more than single heroic moments. And if you zoom out even further you realize the most knightly thing about this era is not the duel, it is the system, the ability to create a fighting culture where men know their place in the line, where banners pull them together, where reserves exist, where pursuit is controlled, where terrain is chosen, and where victory is shaped by decisions that begin hours or days before a sword is drawn. Because the age of knights is the age where war becomes organized enough that a plan can actually exist, even if that plan is constantly threatened by pride, fear, greed, and the human hunger for immediate glory. In the next part, we're going to go deeper into the knight himself as a battlefield tool, how armor actually changed tactics, how knights fought when they were forced off horseback, how formations of men-at-arms behaved, how commanders dealt with arrows and crossbows without losing momentum, and how the knight era slowly evolves toward more professional infantry systems that challenge cavalry dominance. But without turning this into a boring textbook, we will keep it as a vivid war story view of strategy, discipline, and pressure. If you want to understand the knight era at its most real, you have to stop thinking of the knight as a man who charges, and start thinking of him as a protected professional, whose greatest weapon is not the sword, not the lance, not even the horse, but the ability to stay functional under pressure while others are losing shape, because armor is not just metal, it is time, it buys you seconds. And seconds are everything in medieval combat, a second to breathe, a second to step, a second to brace, a second to look up and see the banner, a second to not panic when something hits you, and that tiny advantage, repeated across a group of disciplined men, becomes a tactical force that changes how entire battles are fought. Armor transforms the battlefield into a different kind of problem, because it shifts what is efficient. When most men are lightly protected, a clean cut is enough, but when the elite are covered in mail, helmets, padded layers, and later partial or full plate, the fight becomes about targeting openings, controlling movement, and exhausting the opponent, not about flashy swings, which is why knight combat, when it is serious, looks less like a movie duel and more like a violent wrestling match. With steel, pushing, pulling, trapping limbs, forcing someone off balance, and then using a short weapon to strike where protection is weaker, this is not less brave, it is simply what works, because medieval warfare rewards what works, not what looks pretty. This is also why knights are perfectly capable of fighting on foot, and in many situations they deliberately choose to fight dismounted, because horses are powerful but they are also limits, they need space, good ground, and room to accelerate, they hate dense obstacles, they hate narrow lanes, and they are vulnerable to panic when pressed into crowds. So a commander who is not obsessed with cavalry glory sometimes orders knights to dismount and form an armored infantry block, and this is one of the most underrated realities of the Age of Knights. The elite did not always play the same card, they adapted, because survival and victory matter more than tradition when you are the one standing in the mud. A dismounted knight formation is like turning cavalry into a moving fortress. It is slower, yes, but it is stable, it can hold ground, it can protect a banner, it can guard a choke point, it can support missile troops, and it can resist enemy cavalry by being too dense to break easily. When these armored men-at-arms stand together, they become a wall of weight, and weight is a form of dominance in medieval melee. Because lighter troops can strike but they struggle to push, and pushing is what creates openings, pushing is what forces a line to bend, and bending is what becomes breaking. So what does this armored block actually do in a fight? It does not sprint, it advances in measured steps, it keeps tight spacing, it uses long weapons like spears, polearms, or other staff weapons to control distance, because distance control is how you prevent yourself from being swarmed, and when contact happens, the formation's goal is to maintain cohesion while applying pressure, not to chase individual kills, because chasing kills pulls you out of line, and pulling out of line is how you get surrounded. So the disciplined armored troops fight like a machine made of men, each man protecting the man beside him, each man trusting that the group is stronger than personal skill, and that trust is the invisible armor under the metal armor. Now, missiles, arrows and crossbows, these are the nightmares that force commanders to think carefully, because you can be the bravest rider alive and still lose if your army cannot function under missile pressure, and here is the key truth, most missile weapons do not need to destroy your elite to win, they only need to disrupt your order, because disorder is what turns a strong unit into separate targets. So a commander's approach to missiles is not simply, hope the armor saves you, it is protect cohesion so missiles cannot create panic. This is why you see shields, pavesas in some contexts, why you see formations use terrain like slopes and hedges, why you see units pause behind rises, why you see commanders coordinate movement, because the safest way to cross a lethal zone is to cross it together, steadily, without letting individuals drift into fear-based zigzags, and a disciplined army often treats missiles as weather, unpleasant, dangerous, but manageable if you keep your structure, and the moment the structure is lost. Missiles become devastating not because each projectile is lethal, but because they amplify the collapse. Knights also adapt their equipment and behavior under missile threat. They lower visors at the right times, they keep tighter around banners, they keep mounts calmer by controlling pace, and in some circumstances they avoid exposing cavalry to long missile exchange by using skirmishers and their own missile troops to contest the space, because cavalry is not meant to stand still in the open while being tested. Cavalry needs action, but action must be chosen, not forced, so you either rush in before missiles grind you down, or you maneuver to make the enemy's missiles less effective, and that maneuvering is often the real battlefield, a dance of angles and ground, a chess match where you try to make the enemy's strongest tool point in the wrong direction. This leads to the most important concept in non-boring medieval warfare, combined pressure. The knight era is often misrepresented as knights versus peasants, but the truth is that successful commanders build combinations, infantry pins, missiles irritate, cavalry threatens, reserves punish mistakes, and sieges force decisions without battles. It is never just one weapon, because any single weapon has counters. Cavalry has counters, missiles have counters, heavy infantry has counters, but a system that uses them together is harder to counter, and medieval commanders, especially experienced ones, learn this not from books but from scars and disasters they survive. One of the most dramatic shifts in the later knight era is the growing respect for disciplined infantry, not because infantry suddenly becomes better, but because commanders realize that infantry, when well arranged and properly supported, can resist cavalry long enough to decide the battle, and if infantry can resist cavalry, then cavalry becomes a tool, not the entire plan. Which forces knights and their lords to evolve. They become more willing to fight dismounted, more willing to coordinate with missile troops, more willing to treat cavalry charges as precise strikes rather than the main wave, and this changes the psychology of warfare, because it becomes less about one glorious impact and more about sustained control across phases. This is where men-at-arms become central, professional or semi-professional fighters who may not be knights by title but are trained, armored, disciplined, and paid or obligated to fight. These men often form the core of serious armies, and their presence increases the overall stability of the force. Because stability is contagious, a stable center makes weaker troops behave better. And a stable reserve gives commanders confidence to wait instead of panic charging, which is why you see more careful deployment, more emphasis on reserves, more emphasis on protecting flanks, because commanders are learning, slowly, painfully, that the enemy you cannot see is not the sword. It is the moment your line stops trusting itself. And if you look closely, you see that the knight era is not a single style, it is a long evolution. Early on, cavalry shock feels almost unbeatable in open ground against loose troops. Later on, as more armies learn discipline, as more commanders use terrain and missiles intelligently, the knight's dominance becomes situational, still terrifying, still decisive at the right moment, but no longer a universal answer. And this forces a deeper level of strategy, because now the question is not, do we have knights? It is, can we create a moment where knights matter? How do you create that moment? You pin the enemy with infantry so they cannot pivot. You force them to commit to a fight where their formation is stretched. You pressure one side until it drifts. You use missiles to create a protective flinch that makes men close their eyes at the wrong second. You tempt a countercharge and then punish it with reserves. You use feints, pretend weakness on a flank to draw the enemy into bad ground. Because medieval commanders love bad ground is the trap that cannot be bribed, and then, only then, you release your cavalry in a controlled way, not as a desperate gamble, but as the final shove that turns instability into collapse. On the other side, if you are facing knights, you learn a different set of rules. You choose ground that breaks their momentum, you anchor your line to obstacles, you keep spears dense, you keep morale high by keeping leaders visible, you avoid chasing skirmishers too far, you keep your own cavalry ready to countercharge scattered pursuers, you train your infantry to hold under impact, and most importantly, you learn not to fear the image. Because the image of armored horsemen can break a mind. Before the horse arrives, and the entire purpose of knightly warfare is to win that psychological battle first, so resisting the image is already resistance in the physical sense. All of this brings us to a brutal but fascinating reality. Knights are strongest when they can force you into reacting emotionally. When you react emotionally, you move too early, chase too far, bunch up, leave gaps, lose formation, and then the knights exploit the gap like water exploiting a crack in stone. So the secret to fighting in the age of knights is not only strength, it is patience. Patience is rare. Patience is hard. Patience is discipline, and discipline is the true currency of medieval victory. In the next part, we are going to leave the open battlefield for a moment and dive into the other arena where knights decide wars far more often than people think, the siege and the raid, how knights operate in campaigns week after week, how they cut supply, burn crops, seize bridges, intimidate towns, how castles shape strategy, how siege camps stay disciplined or fall into chaos, and how a war can be won without a single, big battle, through pressure, negotiation, and the slow collapse of the enemy's ability to endure. If you only remember one thing about medieval warfare, remember this: most wars in the Age of Knights were not decided by a single glorious battlefield charge, they were decided by pressure applied day after day, week after week, by men who could move fast, intimidate hard, and stay organized long enough to make the enemy's world feel unsafe, because in the medieval mind, control is not an abstract concept. Control is the ability to sleep at night without fearing that smoke will rise on the horizon. By morning, and knights, more than any other group, were the instruments that could turn a region's daily life into uncertainty, and uncertainty is a weapon that can break a lord's authority faster than swords. This is why raids were so common. Raids are not random barbarism. Raids are strategy executed through pain. A raid targets the enemy's resources and morale at the same time. You burn crops because crops are the future. You seize livestock because livestock is wealth that walks. You destroy mills because mills feed towns. You capture people because people can be ransomed, and the ransom system is not a side detail. It is a financial engine of medieval war. A captured minor noble might be worth months or years of income, which means knights do not only chase victory, they chase value, and value shapes behavior in ways that can win or sabotage a campaign depending on leadership. A raid begins with information. Scouts and local guides are priceless. A commander wants to know which roads are passable, which rivers are fordable, where the enemy patrols, where the villages store grain, where the richest manors are. and where the local castle's garrison can respond from, because a raid must be fast. Speed is survival. If you linger, the region's defenses gather like storm clouds. And suddenly the raiders become the ones being hunted, so knights excel here because they can move quickly, travel light compared to slow infantry columns, and strike like a hammer, not necessarily to destroy the enemy army, but to destroy the enemy's confidence that they can protect their people. In medieval politics, protecting your people is not charity, it is legitimacy. If a lord cannot protect his peasants, those peasants may flee, refuse taxes, or secretly support the enemy, because survival overrides loyalty when survival is threatened. So a raid is psychological warfare. It tells the region, your lord is weak, your lord cannot reach you in time, and every time the enemy burns a village and escapes, that message becomes stronger, and the lord who suffers repeated raids loses authority like a man losing blood slowly, not in one dramatic wound, but in constant draining. But raids are not just destruction, they are also control operations. Sometimes the goal is to capture a bridge, seize a market town, control a road, or simply force the enemy to come out and fight on your terms, because raiding can provoke a desperate response, and desperate responses create mistakes. The enemy might rush their cavalry into bad ground, or split their forces too widely, or abandon a strong defensive position to chase. And commanders love it when the enemy chases, because chasing is how order dissolves. Now, on the other side of medieval warfare stands the castle, and castles are the reason medieval war is slow even when knights are fast, because a castle is a stone statement that says, you cannot simply ride through here, you cannot simply burn and leave, you must either take this place, bypass it at risk, or negotiate, and each option costs time, and time is money, and money is endurance, and endurance decides wars. Castles are not just big houses, they are designed for defense in layers, high walls, towers, narrow entrances, gatehouses, moats, ditches, and the clever use of height, because height turns gravity into a weapon. Defenders can drop stones, shoot arrows, pour hot liquids, and even if you do not want to focus on the gruesome details, the basic idea is simple. Climbing up into a defended position is hard, exhausting, and dangerous, so attackers prefer to avoid direct assault unless they are desperate or have overwhelming advantage. This is why sieges are the heart of medieval strategy, and sieges are not only about brute force, they are about patience, engineering, politics, supply, and morale. A siege is an attempt to squeeze a fortress until it breaks, and there are multiple ways to squeeze. You can starve it, you can bombard it, you can undermine it, you can cut its water, you can bribe someone, you can threaten family members, you can negotiate honorable surrender, you can attack a weak point at night, and often the most efficient way is a combination of several pressures, because human endurance has limits, and the point of a siege is to push the defenders toward those limits while keeping your own army from collapsing into boredom, disease, and desertion. A siege camp is a test of discipline, because unlike a battlefield, there is long waiting, and waiting destroys order if leaders are not strict. Soldiers get hungry, they get restless, they gamble, they fight each other, they wander, they steal from locals, and if discipline collapses inside the camp, the siege collapses too, because a siege requires constant guard, constant patrol, constant work, building earthworks, trenches, palisades, moving supplies, rotating watch, maintaining engines. And in this environment knights function as both fighters and managers. They enforce camp order, lead patrols, protect foraging parties, and keep the siege lines from being broken by defender sorties. Sorties are one of the most dramatic parts of siege warfare. The defenders are not always passive. They sometimes launch sudden attacks from the gate to burn siege engines, kill workers, disrupt trenches, and then retreat back behind walls before the attackers can fully respond, and these sorties can be terrifying because they happen quickly, and they exploit the fact that the besieging army is spread out, some men sleeping, some working, some guarding, and if the defenders strike at the right moment, they can create chaos, which is why siege camps must be organized like a living fortress themselves, with guarded lines, quick response units, and clear signals, and again, knights are central as rapid responders, because mounted troops can move to a threatened point faster than foot soldiers, and armored men can engage the sorties' elite without crumpling. The attackers also have to worry about relief forces, because a siege is like holding your breath. You cannot do it forever, and the longer you hold, the more likely someone comes to punch you in the ribs. A relief army approaching can force a besieger to fight in a bad situation, because the besieging army is tied to the siege works, its lines are stretched, its attention divided, and if the relief force arrives, you may have to choose. Abandon the siege, fight a battle while your troops are spread, or attempt to finish the siege quickly. Each option is risky, and this is why experienced commanders seek to isolate a fortress first, to block roads, control nearby towns, cut supply, capture smaller outposts, and make the fortress feel alone, because a fortress that feels alone is more likely to negotiate. Negotiation is not weakness in medieval war, it is efficiency, and knights and lords understand this. Many sieges ended in surrender terms that preserved life and property in exchange for handing over keys and swearing loyalty, because total destruction is expensive, and medieval rulers often want the land intact so they can profit from it afterward. So the best victory is a fortress that becomes yours without destroying it, and this is why you see formal surrender rituals, handing over banners, hostages, oaths, because medieval war is not always a beast that kills everything, it is often a system of controlled violence used to shift authority. But sometimes negotiation fails, and then the siege becomes physical. Engines like trebuchets appear. Their purpose is to batter walls or to throw projectiles that break morale inside. Mining operations dig tunnels to collapse a section of wall. Assault ladders and siege towers attempt direct entry. And in these moments the knight's role changes again. Now he is not charging across open ground. He might be leading an assault party, coordinating men who push a tower, defending engineers, or standing as the anchor in a chaotic climb, because assaults are chaotic, and chaos is exactly what disciplined elites are meant to survive. If you want the knight era feeling at maximum intensity, imagine the moment a breach opens, the wall is damaged enough that attackers can attempt entry, and suddenly the siege transforms from slow pressure into sudden close combat. Defenders swarm to the breach, attackers surge forward, and in that narrow opening, the fight becomes a grinding contest of bodies and will, because only a limited number can fight at once. Which means individual skill matters again, but it matters inside a system. Because behind the front line are men pushing, shouting, trying to keep momentum, and behind the defenders are men trying to seal the breach, and the commander's job is to feed the breach with fresh fighters without turning it into a jam that blocks itself. And knights, with their armor and training, are often used as the spear tip in that moment, not because they are superheroes, but because they can survive a little longer in the crush, and surviving longer allows the attackers to keep Pressure until the defender's line at the breach finally bends. Yet even when a fortress falls, war is not finished, because medieval war is networked. Castles control roads, roads control supply, supply controls armies, and armies control politics. So a campaign is like dismantling a web node by node. Take one fortress, intimidate a region, cut a river crossing, secure a town, and every move changes what the enemy can do, until the enemy has fewer and fewer options. And when options disappear, a ruler agrees to terms or faces collapse, and knights are the instruments that make those options disappear, because they can move to the next target quickly, they can enforce new authority, they can threaten, they can patrol, they can punish rebels, they can protect supply lines, and they can conduct raids to prevent the enemy from rebuilding confidence. This is also where the Knight era reveals its most brutal truth. War is not only fought against armies, it is fought against economies and communities, because burning a harvest is a strategic act, not a personal one, but it causes suffering anyway, and medieval people understood this, which is why hatred and revenge cycles form, which is why wars become long, why castles change hands repeatedly, why oaths are broken and remade, because in a world where authority depends on protection and pressure, every act of war has a political echo, and knights live inside those echoes, as both symbols of authority and agents of destruction. In the next part, we will take this campaign view and turn it into a living narrative, following a knight-led force through an entire season of war, the march, the raid, the siege camp, the night alarms, the negotiations, the relief army threat, the decisions that separate smart commanders from reckless ones, and the way a campaign ends not with a final duel, but with a balance of exhaustion, fear, and opportunity. The campaign does not begin with steel, it begins with lists, with obligations, with messengers riding out from a lord's hall to the smaller manors and villages that owe him service, because medieval war is built from promises that have to become bodies, and bodies that have to become order. So the first stage is gathering, not in one neat modern barracks, but in scattered points where men arrive with different levels of training, different weapons, different tempers, and the commanders first. Battle is to turn that variety into something that can move without dissolving, which means assigning captains, arranging banners, deciding who rides in front, who guards the wagons, who scouts the roads, who is responsible for discipline when hunger starts making men stupid, and in this stage the knights are already doing their real work, not charging, but controlling, because control is what keeps a host from becoming a mob. When the army finally moves, the march is slow in a way that surprises people who imagine medieval forces as constantly rushing, because speed belongs to small groups, not to a host that needs food, water, animals, spare gear, and some kind of routine, and even a fast, medieval march is still limited by the weakest element, a lame horse, a broken cartwheel, a river crossing, a stretch of mud that turns roads into glue. And every hour lost is not just time, it is cost, because an army eats as it walks, and if the army cannot feed itself, the army breaks, which is why the early march is full of small decisions that look boring but decide everything, where to camp near water without exposing the camp to ambush, how far scouts should ride so they see danger early but do not get isolated, whether to take the main road and risk being watched or take the side routes and risk losing supply and cohesion. And when you imagine the commander in this era, imagine a man constantly balancing speed against order, because speed without order is a trap, but order without speed becomes a slow target. The first objective of the season is not necessarily the enemy's army, it is the enemy's confidence, so the commander chooses a raid target that is meaningful, a market town that supplies the region, a river crossing that controls movement, a rich manor where livestock and grain can be seized, and he does not simply charge in blindly, he breaks his force into roles, the raiding party rides light and fast. The main body stays close enough to support but not so close that it drags the raid into slowness, and a screen of riders sweeps the edges to prevent surprises, because the nightmare of a raid is a sudden counterattack that hits you while you are loaded with stolen goods and scattered in small groups, and the entire art is to strike hard, collect value, destroy what you cannot carry, and leave before the enemy's response can form into something coherent. So the raid happens at dawn when the town is half awake, not as a movie scene of flaming chaos but as a controlled shock. Riders enter, voices shout, doors slam, animals cry, and within minutes the psychological battle is decided, because most towns are not built to resist a mounted strike unless they have strong walls and prepared defenders, and the goal is to make the town feel helpless quickly so that resistance collapses. Because resistance is expensive, the commander wants speed, not a street-by-street brawl that bleeds his elite, so he uses intimidation like a tool, and this is one of the darker truths of the Night Era. Intimidation is not accidental, it is calculated, it is meant to make people surrender before the killing becomes messy, and once fear does its job, the raid becomes collection and destruction, wagons are filled, prisoners are taken, livestock is driven, grain stores are spoiled or burned, and then the raiders vanish like a storm that touched the land and moved on, leaving smoke as a message that will spread faster than any official proclamation. After the raid, the commander does not relax, he expects pursuit, so he chooses his route back carefully, he keeps rear guards tight, he avoids narrow lanes where his column could be pinned, and he watches the horizon for dust, because dust means movement, movement means response, and response means the enemy is trying to regain control over the story, to prove they are not helpless, and if the enemy's cavalry appears too quickly, the commander might do something that looks cautious but is actually aggressive in the long game. He might stop on favorable ground and present a line, not to fight a full battle, but to signal that pursuit will be costly, because medieval warfare is often about convincing the enemy that your decisions are too expensive to challenge, and when that signal works, the pursuers slow down, they hesitate, they let you go, and that hesitation is a victory, because it shows your pressure is working. Now comes the siege choice, because the raid is a knife, but the siege is the hand that holds the enemy down, and the commander chooses a fortress that matters, not necessarily the strongest one, but the one that controls a road or a river, the one that anchors the enemy's ability to patrol and respond, the one whose fall will make the whole region feel exposed, and when the army arrives, the fortress does not fall just because you arrived. It stares at you from stone height like a stubborn idea, and the siege begins with the most important move of all, isolation, cutting off movement in and out, occupying nearby villages, controlling roads, setting up watch points, because if you cannot isolate a castle, you are not besieging it, you are simply camping near it while it laughs at you. The siege camp forms like a temporary town of war, and this is where discipline becomes a daily battle, because soldiers get bored and hunger turns boredom into violence, so the commander establishes rules, patrol schedules, punishment for theft inside the camp, controlled foraging parties guarded by knights, rotation on watch so men do not fall asleep, and constant signals so if the defenders launch a sortie, the camp does not respond like a startled animal, and the nights become the camps. Spine again, not just because they can fight better, but because they can enforce obedience, and obedience is what keeps the siege lines from becoming weak enough for the defenders to exploit. Inside the fortress, the defenders watch and measure. They count how many men you have, where your engines are being built, how often your patrols rotate, where your weakest point is, and they test you with small attacks, a sudden rush out of the gate at night to burn a half-finished engine, a quick strike at a supply wagon, a volley from the walls that kills a few men and then retreats into stone safety, and each test is meant to do two things: hurt you a little, and provoke you into doing something stupid, and the commander's challenge is to not take the bait, because the enemy wants you to assault too soon, to waste lives and morale on walls that do not care how brave you are. As days turn into weeks, siege warfare becomes a struggle of endurance, not only for the defenders but for the besiegers, because the besiegers must maintain a camp in enemy territory. Sickness spreads, food becomes harder to gather, local resentment grows, desertion whispers like a quiet infection, and now the campaign becomes psychological for the commander too, because he must constantly project certainty, even if he is worried, because if the commander looks unsure, uncertainty spreads, and a siege camp filled with uncertainty becomes porous. Men wander, guards relax, discipline weakens, and the defenders can smell weakness the way animals smell blood. Then comes the message that changes everything: a relief force is coming, and whether this is true or exaggerated, it becomes real the moment your men believe it, because belief shapes behavior. Some men begin to panic, some begin to hide loot, some begin to argue about whether to abandon the siege, and the commander must respond like a surgeon, quickly, cleanly, restoring control. He sends scouts farther out. He tightens the camp perimeter. He concentrates his cavalry so it can respond. He establishes clear fallback positions, and he begins to think about the siege as a time bomb, because if the relief force arrives while you are spread thin, you might be forced into a battle under bad conditions, and medieval commanders fear battles under bad conditions more than they fear anything, because bad conditions make discipline fragile, and fragile discipline turns elite units into expensive losses. Now you see why negotiation becomes part of the war machine, because the commander might prefer to end the siege before the relief force arrives, not by storming the walls, but by making surrender feel like the best option for the defenders, and he uses pressure like a language. He increases bombardment if he has engines, he tightens the blockade, he demonstrates that supplies will not get through, he shows captured prisoners. He offers honorable terms, and behind the scenes he might bribe, he might threaten, he might offer safe passage, because medieval conflict is not always a pure contest of strength, it is often a contest of endurance and calculation, and if you can win without losing your men, you win twice. Suppose the defenders hesitate, they do not surrender immediately, but they open talks, and that alone is a crack, because the moment defenders talk, they admit that surrender is possible, and possible becomes thinkable, and thinkable becomes contagious, and in a fortress under pressure, contagion of doubt is lethal, so the commander accelerates that doubt, he keeps his terms clear and believable, he presents the future. Surrender now and live, resist longer and face harsher conditions, and this is one of the most strategic aspects of the Knight era, the ability to turn war into a set of choices where the enemy chooses the outcome you want, not because you forced it with one blow, but because you arranged the situation so that every other option becomes worse. But if negotiations fail and the relief force truly approaches, the commander has to make the hardest decision of the season: stay or lift the siege, and this decision depends on intelligence, the size of the relief force, the condition of his own army, the quality of the ground around the camp, and the time needed to retreat without being destroyed, because retreat in medieval warfare is not walking away. It is a controlled withdrawal under threat, and if you retreat badly, you turn into a rout, and a rout becomes slaughter, so the commander might choose a third option. He might not abandon the siege entirely, but he might reposition. He might leave a smaller force to maintain the blockade while he prepares an ambush for the relief army, because if he can defeat the relief force, the fortress becomes truly isolated, and isolation is death for a garrison's hope. So the campaign reaches its climax not always at the castle wall, but on the road where relief forces move, where scouts clash, where cavalry screens feel each other out, and where both sides try to force the other into unfavorable ground, because if a battle happens here, it is a battle shaped by the siege, shaped by fatigue, shaped by supplies, shaped by morale, and shaped by the fact that one side is protecting a fortress while the other is trying to finish an investment before it becomes a trap. Imagine the relief force arrives near dusk, not a giant cinematic mass, but a real medieval host with banners and dust and uneven lines. They move cautiously. They know the besiegers might have prepared traps, and the besiegers know the relief force might be stronger than expected, so both sides probe, and this is where the Knight Era's combined arms system shows again. Cavalry screens collide in small skirmishes, missile troops test range. Infantry blocks take positions, reserves hover behind. And the commander's goal is not necessarily to win an absolute victory, it is to achieve a strategic result, either drive the relief force away, or protect his own retreat, or delay long enough for the fortress to surrender, because surrender might be closer than the relief force realizes. And then, sometimes, the season ends not with a decisive battle, but with a quiet agreement. The fortress surrenders under terms, keys are handed over, hostages are exchanged, oaths are sworn, banners change, and the relief force, seeing that the strategic anchor is gone, withdraws to protect something else, and suddenly the campaign's violence collapses into paperwork again, into promises again, into the rebuilding of order under new authority, because medieval war is a cycle of pressure and settlement, pressure and settlement, and the knights remain in the center of the cycle, enforcing the new order, patrolling roads, collecting taxes, guarding crossings, and preparing for the next season, because in this era, peace is not a permanent condition, it is a pause between pressures. But even when a campaign ends, its consequences remain. Villages burned, remember. Families ransomed, remember. Lords humiliated, remember. And that memory is fuel, so the commander who wins must think forward. He must garrison the captured fortress, reward his men enough to keep them loyal, keep discipline so his army does not turn into a threat to his own lands, and manage the politics of victory. Because a victory that creates fear among allies can become the seed of future rebellion, and this is why the Knight Era is never only about tactics, it is about governance through controlled violence, and the best commanders are those who understand that the battlefield is only one room in the house of war. In the next part, we'll go even deeper into the knightly culture that grows from this cycle, not the romantic version, but the functional one, tournaments as training and propaganda, chivalry as a discipline system, ransom economics, hostage politics, the obsession with reputation, and how knights become a social class that survives not because they are always the best fighters, but because they are the best at turning violence into status, status into resources, and resources back into Violence. If you want to understand why knights dominated medieval war culture for so long, you have to stop thinking of them as only fighters and start seeing them as a class that learned how to convert battlefield power into money, and money into more battlefield power, because in the knight era the sword is not just a weapon, it is a lever, and the lever moves land, titles, marriages, alliances, and fear, and what looks like honor from the outside is often a practical framework designed to keep this class stable, disciplined, and profitable across generations. So chivalry is not only romance, it is also a control system, a rulebook that makes elite violence predictable enough to be useful rather than self-destructive. The most important economic fact of knight warfare is ransom, because ransom changes everything about how people fight. When you know that a noble enemy is worth more alive than dead, your instincts shift, the fight becomes a hunt for valuable captures, and that hunt shapes tactics, behavior, and even the morality of the battlefield, because the battlefield is not just a place where men die, it is a marketplace of leverage, and leverage is often taken in the form of a living body with a recognizable coat of arms. Ransom creates a strange kind of restraint among elites, not because they are kind, but because killing value is stupid business, so knights train themselves to recognize status markers, to spot rich armor, expensive horses, known banners, and famous men, and when they find them, the objective becomes capture, not destruction, and capture is not simple. You have to isolate the target, overwhelm him, dismount him or corner him, force surrender, and then protect him from the chaos that might accidentally kill him, because an unprotected prisoner can be lost to a random blow or a desperate soldier who doesn't care about your future profit. This is why medieval battles often contain two wars at once, the war of formations and survival, and the war of opportunity and capture, and good commanders have to manage this tension, because knights chasing ransoms too early can break the plan. They can abandon the banner, chase a noble across muddy ground, get separated, and suddenly your elite is scattered because they smell money, and money is a powerful scent. So discipline is required not only against fear, but against greed. Greed is as dangerous as panic, because both cause disorder. So chivalry, in its real function, becomes a cultural tool that tries to bind greed and courage to a controlled form. It teaches knights to seek glory, but in a way that still serves hierarchy. It praises loyalty to your lord, not random freelancing. It praises bravery, but ideally bravery that happens at the right time under the right banner, and it praises restraint among equals, because restraint protects the ransom economy that benefits the entire class, and once you realize this, a lot of medieval honor talk becomes more readable. It is not pure fantasy, it is a practical language that justifies and stabilizes elite behavior. Now, reputation. Reputation is another weapon that doesn't look like a weapon until you see how it moves armies. In a world without instant communication, reputation travels like smoke, slow but unstoppable, and when an army hears that a certain knight is ruthless, unstoppable, or never breaks, that rumor changes how they stand on the day of battle, because morale is a calculation of risk. And reputation changes the numbers in that calculation before the fight even begins. Medieval knights understood this instinctively. They invested in reputation like a modern empire invests in propaganda. They wanted stories told about them, not only because they wanted praise, but because praise increases intimidation, and intimidation is the cheapest victory you can buy. If the enemy doubts themselves, they make mistakes. If their men believe your cavalry is unstoppable, they brace too early. They bunch up too tight, they waste energy, they lose confidence, and once confidence cracks, everything else follows, so the knight class creates a culture where stories are currency, and poets, chroniclers, and rumor networks become part of the war machine. This is where tournaments enter the picture, and tournaments are not simply games, they are training, advertising, and selection all at once. A tournament is a controlled environment where knights test themselves, prove themselves, build alliances, and learn tactical habits that carry into war, because even if a tournament is not war, it is still a rehearsal of violence, horses, lances, formation riding, endurance under armor, decision-making under adrenaline, and the ability to remain composed while everyone is watching, and that last part matters more than people think, because a knight's status depends on public performance, and public performance pressures men to stay disciplined, to avoid looking weak, to develop control over their own fear. A tournament also functions as networking, and networking is power. Knights meet other knights, form friendships, rivalries, and alliances, they find patrons, they negotiate marriages, they exchange favors, and those relationships later shape campaigns, because medieval warfare is rarely anonymous. The people you fight beside today might be the people who join your lord next year. The people you capture today might be the people you need as allies later, so the knight class builds a social web. And that web makes them resilient, because even if one lord falls, a skilled knight can attach himself elsewhere, and this mobility of elite fighters keeps the system alive. But chivalry is not only outward display, it is also internal discipline. The knight is expected to follow a code, not always perfectly, but the existence of the code creates a standard that can be used to shame and punish, and shame is a weapon in a status society. If a knight is labeled a coward, an oathbreaker, or dishonorable, his social value collapses, and social value is literally material value. Because material rewards come through social recognition, land grants, positions, ransoms, marriages, and invitations to campaigns, so the code becomes a control collar, not always visible, but always tightening when someone tries to act purely selfishly. This is why the knight era produces so many rituals, oaths, ceremonies, banner presentations, vows before battle, the language of service, because ritual makes hierarchy feel sacred, and if hierarchy feels sacred, it is harder to question in a moment of fear or greed, and when men are hungry and exhausted, they cling to structure, so the structure is reinforced by symbols, and symbols become real enough to guide behavior. Hostages are also part of this system, and hostages are not just victims, they are political locks. A noble family might send a son to another court as a guest, but everyone understands the truth: the guest is a guarantee, and guarantees make alliances possible, because medieval politics runs on trust that is never fully trusted, so hostages are physical insurance. And the knight class operates inside this insurance economy. They escort hostages, guard them, negotiate exchanges, and sometimes fight battles specifically to rescue or secure them, because a hostage can be more powerful than a fortress if that hostage holds a family's future in his hands. When you combine ransom, reputation, tournaments, chivalry, and hostages, you see the full engine. The knight era is not just a battlefield style, it is a society built to produce and maintain an elite that can fight, lead, and profit in a world where violence is political language, and because this elite is expensive, it has to justify itself constantly, it has to claim moral purpose, religious legitimacy, and cultural prestige, And that is why chivalry is spoken like a moral truth, because if it were spoken as a business model, it would sound ugly, and ugliness is bad for legitimacy. But the engine has cracks, because the more war becomes expensive and systemized, the more it depends on stable finances and stable loyalty, and the more it depends on stable loyalty, the more it becomes vulnerable to new pressures. Long wars drain treasuries, plagues drain manpower, rising towns drain the monopoly of nobility, and disciplined infantry and effective missile tactics drain the battlefield advantage of cavalry, so the knight class must evolve or be outpaced, and evolution is painful when it threatens a culture's identity. So in the next part, we're going to turn the lens toward the hard counters that start to reshape the knight era, not as a boring list, but as a living shift in how battles feel, how commanders think, and how knights respond when they realize that bravery and armor are not enough if the enemy can hold formation, choose ground, and punish the proud mistake of chasing glory. For a long time the medieval knight feels like the perfect answer to war. Armor buys survival, horses buy speed, training buys discipline, and social status buys leadership, so it is easy to imagine this elite as something unstoppable. But war is a living contest, and the moment one side becomes predictable, the other side starts building a key, and the key that begins to challenge knights is not a single miracle weapon. It is a set of ideas that spread slowly and then suddenly become obvious. Discipline can be taught to men who are not nobles, formation can be stronger than individual skill, terrain can defeat momentum, missiles can shape fear, and a commander can win by forcing a knight to fight in the wrong place at the wrong time. And once those ideas take root, the knight era does not disappear overnight, but it changes. It becomes sharper, more careful, and sometimes more desperate. Because dominance that is challenged often becomes more violent before it becomes less. The first and most important counter is disciplined infantry, because cavalry does not fear bravery, cavalry fears a line that will not move, and you do not build that line by giving men weapons, you build it by teaching them to trust each other under pressure, by teaching them how to lock shoulders, how to brace, how to keep spears angled, how to not break when something loud and heavy is coming straight at them. And this is a psychological achievement as much as a physical one, because the horse is a psychological weapon. It is not only a body, it is a moving threat that makes the mind imagine being crushed, and when infantry learns to resist that imagination, cavalry's advantage shrinks. A disciplined spear line does not need to kill every knight, it only needs to deny the clean break, because if the cavalry cannot break the line, the cavalry must withdraw, reform, and try again, and every attempt tires horses, disrupts rider order, and increases risk, and once the cavalry begins to look uncertain, the fear transfers in the opposite direction. Now the infantry believes it can hold. And belief creates stability, and stability creates a kind of slow dominance, because a stable line forces the knights to spend energy and risk without gaining a decisive result, and in medieval warfare, spending without gaining is how you lose campaigns. This is where the long weapons become more than tools. Spears, pikes, bills, halberds in later contexts. These weapons are not only about reach, they are about control. A long weapon controls space. It tells the horse, you cannot enter here without pain. It tells the armored man, you cannot close without being pushed. And when many long weapons overlap, they create a fence that moves with the infantry's will, and that fence can hurt cavalry away from certain angles, forcing knights into narrower attack lanes. and narrow lanes are where cavalry loses its collective momentum and becomes a series of individual collisions, and individual collisions are exactly what disciplined infantry wants. But infantry discipline alone is not enough if cavalry can simply go around, which is why terrain and positioning become crucial. The best anti-cavalry commanders learn to anchor flanks. They place one flank on a river, the other on a forest edge. They build simple obstacles, stakes, ditches, wagons, anything that disrupts the horse's ideal approach, and they choose ground that is slightly uphill, slightly rough, slightly broken, because cavalry needs smooth acceleration to become a shock wall. And if you remove smoothness, you remove the wall, you turn a charge into a hesitant push, and a hesitant push is a gift to defenders. The second major counter is effective missile use, and missiles are not just arrows kill knights, missiles are arrows and bolts make knights behave differently, because the real power of a missile weapon in this era is not always penetration, it is pressure on time, it forces movement, it punishes waiting, it drains morale, it makes commanders decide sooner than they want, and it can separate cavalry from their preferred rhythm. Because cavalry wants the moment of release, not the slow grind of being watched and wounded at range. Crossbows in particular have a psychological role, the sound, the speed, the sense that a bolt can strike hard and unexpectedly, makes armored men cautious, not because they are cowards, but because they are rational. An expensive elite cannot afford to be careless, and archers, when used in mass and in good position, can force cavalry to either charge too early or retreat, and both outcomes can be manipulated. Because if cavalry charges too early, it hits prepared infantry, and if it retreats, it concedes initiative, and initiative is a mental advantage that shapes how the rest of the day unfolds. The third counter is the trap of pursuit, and this is an enemy strategy that does not require superior weapons, only superior patience, because knights are naturally tempted by pursuit. Pursuit is where glory and profit live, and an enemy commander who understands this can lure knights into overextension. He can fake a retreat, he can scatter deliberately, he can leave valuable-looking targets behind, he can pull cavalry across rough ground, or into a narrow valley, or toward a hidden reserve. And then the pursuers, stretched and separated, are hit by a fresh counterforce, and the beautiful thing about this strategy is that it weaponizes the knight's strength against itself. The knight's speed becomes his separation, his aggression becomes his distance from support, his hunger for capture becomes his vulnerability, and the moment he is isolated, his armor becomes weight, his horse becomes a limited turning radius, and the enemy can swarm edges and cut him off, not necessarily killing him immediately, but forcing him to surrender, and surrender becomes ransom, and ransom becomes humiliation and financial loss. These counters produce a new kind of medieval warfare, one where knights remain central but cannot be lazy in their thinking. They must coordinate more tightly, they must respect infantry more, they must treat missiles seriously, they must use terrain like engineers, and they must accept that sometimes the best use of cavalry is not to charge but to threaten, because threat can shape enemy movement, and shaped movement can create the gap you need, so knights and their commanders begin to use cavalry as a pressure tool rather than a final answer. This is where feints become more important. Cavalry moves toward a flank not to hit it, but to force it to turn, and when infantry turns, its line becomes vulnerable to missiles or to another attack, and the commander's mind becomes a constant search for a moment when the enemy's cohesion is stressed in two directions at once, because cohesion is hardest to maintain when you are pulled, not pushed. When you are forced to answer threats on multiple sides, so cavalry becomes a way to create multiple questions at the same time, and infantry becomes the way to hold your own answer stable. Knights also adapt by increasing dismounted fighting, because fighting dismounted reduces vulnerability to terrain and allows armored elites to become the anchor of the line, and when the elite fights as heavy infantry, the enemy's missile pressure may still hurt, but the elite's cohesion can stabilize weaker troops, and the battle becomes a contest of two stable bodies rather than one shock versus one fear, and in that contest, leadership, reserves, and timing become even more decisive. Because when neither side breaks quickly, small advantages accumulate, fatigue becomes a weapon, morale becomes a slow-moving tide, and a commander who knows when to rotate tired units and commit reserves can win without a dramatic moment, which is ironically a very uncinematic victory but a deeply strategic one. This adaptation also changes the internal culture of knighthood, because the old image of the knight as purely mounted warrior becomes less accurate. The knight becomes a flexible elite, sometimes mounted, sometimes dismounted, sometimes leading raids, sometimes leading siege assaults, sometimes acting as the rear guard in retreats, sometimes guarding supply routes, and this flexibility becomes a mark of professionalism. And professionalism becomes more valuable than pure aristocratic identity. Because wars become longer, more complex, more expensive, and the lord who can feel disciplined, flexible elites gains an advantage over the lord who only relies on traditional shock. At the same time, the counters to knights do not erase knights, they force them into a new relationship with the rest of the army. The knight era becomes less about a single class winning alone and more about combined arms, and this combined arms mentality is the bridge to later military evolution, but within the medieval style, because banners still matter, loyalty still matters, ransom still matters, castles still matter, and the battlefield is still a place where identity and fear and greed are as important as steel. So the shift is not a clean revolution, it is a slow tightening of reality around the myth. The myth still exists, but the commanders who survive are those who treat myth as morale and treat reality as a plan. Now, here is the most important dramatic consequence of these counters. Battles become more about pre-battle decisions, because if knights cannot simply smash through anything, then choosing ground, scouting, supply, timing, and reserve placement become even more critical, and this makes medieval warfare feel more like a thinking game, the kind of game where a commander wins by making the enemy fight while tired, while hungry, while uncertain, while their alliance is shaky, while their camp is anxious, and then, only then, when the enemy's structure is already fraying, the knights strike, not as a guaranteed win, but as the final push that turns weakness into collapse. In the next part, we will bring all of this together into a high-intensity narrative of a battle where both sides understand these counters, where knights cannot be careless, where infantry discipline matters, where missiles shape movement, where feints and reserves decide the day, and where victory depends on who controls the moment of pursuit, because the pursuit is still the place where medieval battles turn from advantage into domination, and the best commanders do not let their own knights destroy their victory by chasing too far into a trap. The day begins with a truth both commanders already understand: nobody here believes in easy victories, nobody expects the enemy to panic at the first sight of armored horsemen, and that changes everything, because when both sides know the counters, the battle becomes a contest of patience and controlled pressure, not a contest of who can shout louder, and the field itself feels like a decision that has already been made. A wide stretch with subtle slopes and uneven patches, a line of trees on one side, a low rise on the other, and a shallow wet area that looks harmless until a horse tries to cross it at speed, and both armies read the ground like a warning written in plain language. Cavalry can win here, but only if it is used with precision. Infantry can hold here, but only if it keeps its spine unbroken. Missiles can matter here, but only if they are protected long enough to do their work. The commander of the night-heavy host does not rush to form a single massive charge, because a single massive charge is exactly what the disciplined enemy wants. The enemy has spears set, ranks tight, flanks anchored, and a calm that feels almost insulting, so instead the night commander builds a layered plan. He places infantry forward enough to claim the center without committing to a full clash. He positions missile troops so they can reach the enemy line but not so far that they are swallowed by a sudden counter-push, and he keeps his mounted elites behind, not hidden, but clearly visible, because visibility is part of pressure. The enemy must feel the threat, must know that the charge exists, because the threat forces the enemy to make small choices, and small choices create small distortions, and distortions are where battles begin to tilt. Across the field, the opposing commander responds with the kind of discipline that looks boring only to people who don't understand it. He does not chase the skirmishers, he does not surge forward to prove bravery, he keeps his line tight and stable, he keeps his spear points angled in a way that discourages a clean impact, and he keeps a reserve behind a low rise, a fresh block that cannot be seen clearly from the enemy side. Because hidden strength is the most dangerous kind. Hidden strength creates uncertainty, and uncertainty makes knights hesitate at the worst moment, and hesitation is deadly when your plan depends on momentum. The first phase is missiles, but it is not random shooting, it is deliberate irritation. The knight commander wants the enemy to lift shields, to tighten, to react, because reacting consumes energy, and energy matters, so arrows and bolts begin to travel, not as a magical rain that deletes armored men, but as a constant pressure that forces posture changes. The enemy line absorbs it, shield angles shift, heads dip, men brace, and the disciplined commander refuses to step forward too quickly. Because stepping forward is what the cavalry wants. Stepping forward loosens the spear fence and creates the kind of half-committed movement that cavalry can exploit. The knight commander watches all of this like a man watching cracks in ice. He is not asking, how many are dying? He is asking, how many are shifting? Because shift is the beginning of break, and he sees something small, a slight drift on the enemy's right flank, not a panic, not a rout, just a tiny reposition as they try to keep their flank anchored near the trees while still presenting a forward face. And that tiny reposition creates a tiny angle, and angles are everything, because cavalry does not need the whole line to fail, it needs one segment to become vulnerable for a few seconds. So he does what smart knight commanders do when they face disciplined infantry. He feints, he sends a mounted group toward that flank in a controlled approach, not a full charge, just a forward movement that forces attention, and attention is a resource. The enemy commander must now decide, does he thicken that flank, does he shift his reserve, does he send his own cavalry to counter-threat, and every decision pulls something from somewhere else. And the knight commander is not trying to win instantly. He is trying to pull the enemy's structure out of perfect alignment the way you pull a thread from a tight knot. The enemy commander does not panic, he responds with the most important anti-knight discipline of all, he refuses to overreact, he does not send his reserve yet, he does not rush his cavalry, he slightly reinforces the threatened flank with a measured shift, and the key word is measured, because a measured shift keeps cohesion, but even measured shifts cost something. They create a moment where the line is adjusting, where spacing is imperfect, where the attention of officers is on alignment rather than on threats, and the Knight Commander senses that moment like an animal sensing an opening in a fence. Now he does the second move, the real move. While the enemy's attention is drawn toward the flank threat, he increases missile pressure on the center, not to kill but to make the center tense, because a tense center is more likely to flinch at impact, and then he pushes his infantry forward slightly, not enough to fully commit, but enough to create the illusion that a main clash is about to begin, and that illusion forces the enemy to brace. And bracing is another kind of tension, and tension is what makes men stiff. Stiff men tire faster. Stiff men also make worse micro-decisions when the shock arrives. Then the Knight Commander releases a smaller, sharper cavalry strike, not the whole mass, but a focused group aimed at a narrow segment of the enemy line that is now slightly out of perfect alignment because of the earlier shift, and the cavalry does not gallop in like a loose pack, it advances in a tight, controlled front, spacing maintained, lances angled, banners visible, because banners keep men together when adrenaline wants to split them into individual stories, and this is the truth of effective medieval cavalry. It is collective discipline moving at speed. The impact is not a cinematic explosion, it is a crushing contest of will and physics. The enemy's spear line holds, but it bends slightly, the horses refuse to fully impale themselves on points, the riders try to push at the edges rather than the densest center, and for a few seconds everything is compressed into noise and pressure. And here is the critical detail: even if nobody breaks, the contact creates microgaps. Men step back half a foot, shields shift, a spear angle changes, and a second later the cavalry pulls away to avoid becoming stalled, because stalling is death, and the enemy line is still standing, but it is no longer perfectly calm, it has felt the weight, and feeling the weight changes confidence in subtle ways. Now the enemy commander has a choice: he can stay purely defensive and allow the cavalry to repeat these tests until fatigue and pressure create a larger crack, or he can counter to seize initiative, and this is where many disciplined armies lose their discipline, because the desire to answer can become a rash push. And the Knight Commander is hoping for that rash push. He is hoping the enemy will surge forward to punish the withdrawing cavalry, because surging forward stretches the spear fence and breaks the anchored stability that makes cavalry hate you. The enemy commander is good, so he does not surge blindly. Instead he launches a controlled counter-move. He sends forward a tough infantry push to reclaim space without losing formation, and he uses his own missile troops to harass the cavalry as it reforms, and this is the duel between smart commanders. They are not trading swords, they are trading structure, each trying to damage the other's cohesion without damaging their own, and the battlefield becomes a living diagram of pressure lines. Now the Knight Commander introduces the reserve factor, the part that separates experienced leadership from desperation. He commits a fresh unit of men-at-arms, some mounted, some ready to dismount if necessary, and he does it not to smash the enemy frontally, but to create a second threat lane, because one threat can be answered, two threats force compromise, and compromise creates weakness somewhere, and while this happens, his infantry continues to press in a steady line, not rushing, not breaking, just advancing like a slow wall, because the infantry's job is to pin, to hold the enemy in place so the cavalry can choose the moment and angle of decisive pressure. The enemy commander responds with his hidden reserve behind the low rise, and when that reserve appears, it changes the emotional temperature of the field instantly, because fresh troops are like cold water poured on a hot plan. They can stabilize a flank, plug a gap, and most importantly threaten the pursuers, and the enemy uses this reserve not to attack immediately, but to position like a door that can close. Because the enemy commander is thinking about the one thing that decides medieval battles more often than people admit, the pursuit trap. He knows that if the knight host senses a break and chases too far, he can slam that reserve into the scattered pursuers and turn victory into disaster. So the middle phase of the battle becomes a pressure cooker. Cavalry feints, infantry pushes, missiles irritate, reserves hover, and both commanders are watching for the same thing, the moment the other side becomes emotionally committed, because emotional commitment is what makes men forget spacing, forget signals, forget the banner, forget the plan, and plans die when banners become distant. Then it happens, not as a dramatic scream, but as a subtle failure. A segment of the enemy line begins to pull backward, not running, just stepping back to avoid being squeezed, and that backward movement spreads a few ranks like a slow ripple, and ripples are dangerous, because ripples can turn into waves if pressure continues, and the knight commander sees the ripple and feels the temptation. This is the moment knights dream about. The moment where the enemy is not broken yet but is not perfectly stable either, the moment where one hard shove could turn movement into collapse. He gives the signal for a larger cavalry release, but he tries to keep it controlled. He sends it not as one uncontrolled flood but in waves with gaps, and he keeps a portion held back, because he is thinking about the pursuit trap too. He wants the break, but he does not want his men to scatter into greed, and as the cavalry advances, the enemy commander executes his own plan. He allows a controlled retreat in that segment, not a rout, but a deliberate pull, because deliberate pulls are bait. They pull knights forward, they stretch them out, and stretched knights are vulnerable. Now the field becomes a test of discipline against hunger, because once the enemy's line begins to give ground, knights smell opportunity, they see backs, they see isolated groups, they imagine ransoms, and the urge to chase becomes a physical itch, and this is where the best leaders shout the hardest, not charge, but stay with the banner, because staying with the banner is staying with your survival. But not every man hears. Not every man obeys, and a few groups surge ahead like sparks, leaving a fire. The enemy commander waits for exactly that. He watches those sparks separate from the main body. He watches them move into slightly rougher ground near the wet patch, and then he closes the door. His reserve surges out from behind the rise into the scattered pursuers, not to annihilate them in a dramatic sweep, but to block, to trap, to cut off the path back, and suddenly those forward knights feel the mood flip. The chase becomes a trap. And the trap is psychological before it is physical. Because the first thing a trapped man feels is isolation, and isolation breaks confidence faster than any weapon. Now the knight commander faces the crisis moment that defines command quality. Does he throw his entire mass forward to rescue the scattered pursuers and risk turning his whole army into the same trap, or does he pull back, accept losses, and preserve the campaign? And this is the harsh truth of medieval warfare. Sometimes the best decision is to stop the chase even when your men are screaming for it. Because the chase can eat your future, and the knight commander chooses the disciplined rescue. He sends a controlled group to open a lane. He advances infantry to stabilize the center. He orders his main cavalry to hold and reform rather than flood forward, and this is where you see the difference between a war leader and a glory leader. The war leader sacrifices the fantasy of total domination to preserve the reality of winning.